people, their impression of you is, many people like you, of course, that's your fan base. Other people are reviled and horrified by you and what you supposedly stand for. Is that a fair assessment of things?
Well, I've always measured success not only by the amount of people that love you, but the ones that hate you too. Because if you do something that everybody loves, it's not really worth too much.
And do you like to get people upset? Is that part of what fuels you?
I like to provoke people so they think. You know, I think that's a healthy part of entertainment.
Psycho-Pass is one of the most interesting anime that I have ever watched. I don't think that's necessarily an uncommon opinion in the anime community, truth be told, and I'm not exactly unique in my take regarding the show, as it has a lot going for it. A sci-fi thriller dystopian detective show written by Gen Urobuchi, I can guarantee sounds interesting to most people, and frankly, the show does not disappoint. There are a lot of things to like about the show. Its inspiration from classic dystopian novels, movies, and cyberpunk anime, to the setting, where Japan has indoctrinated the Sibyl system, where citizens' minds are monitored to prevent crime, and the philosophical implications that come from the system. The amazing cast of characters, from the naive yet endearing Akane, the cold, no-nonsense detective Ginoza, or the sexiest man alive, known as Kogami. Each character has an interesting personality, motivations, and developments later on in the story that tie directly into the dystopia known currently as Japan, making the show feel incredibly grounded in reality. Many of the character arcs and ideological beliefs that the show tackles are dependent on the Sibyl system and the setting of the show, which is why, in my opinion, Psycho-Pass is one of the best anime out there when it comes to conveying atmosphere through its visuals. Japan in the show is incredibly reliant on futuristic technology, and you practically cannot live without it in this setting. The questions that the show asks the viewer are incredibly interesting and thought-provoking. If you ask someone who has watched the show what their opinion on the Sibyl system is, you will get many different responses dependent on who you are talking to, along with the ideology or ideologies they hold in their heart. The system is not perfect, as the first episode proves this immediately, condemning an innocent rape victim after her assaulter is murdered by our main cast, with her hue slowly getting more red as the trauma sets in after not only being raped, but witnessing a murder. The Sibyl system is brutal and doesn't sympathize with individuals that have a high crime coefficient no matter the context. But it isn't all bad, admittedly, as the system does overall prevent most violent crimes. The system has a somewhat utilitarian point of view, which is something that Gen Urobuchi tackles a lot in his works. I would imagine that many of the ideological opinions of the viewers of the show depend on how the viewer sees utilitarianism as a concept. I could have a completely different view of the system compared to yours, mainly due to the values I hold true to my heart, and that's what makes the system incredibly interesting to me. Regarding ideology, there is no character that has an arguably more important ideological belief in the story than Shogo Makishima. Makishima is the main antagonist of the show, and a man who views the Sibyl system in a negative light, but not in the typical way that many would see it as. Makishima's problems with the system revolve around the fact that he is a full-blown sadistic killer who enjoys the violent sides of humanity, and with the system preventing many humans' violent sides from coming out, it would naturally make him extremely angry. In Makishima's opinion, humans are at their most interesting when they can express themselves to the fullest. They make people unique. The system prevents many humans from having interesting lives, as it cares much more about society functioning as a whole rather than individual people expressing themselves. Makishima views society as incredibly boring due to people shying away the more aggressive and primal sides of the human mind, with him mostly needing others in this world that can have the same joys as him. If someone gets the same amount of joy as he does when committing a murder, then he would naturally be happy. This is partially why he views Kogami as an interesting man, as he is mostly dictated by emotions, whether they be negative or not. When it comes to the characters of the show, Makishima feels strangely alien compared to the others. Part of this comes from his character design and voice acting, with his silver hair, yellow eyes, and incredibly soothing voice.
この世界を監視し、支配するために生まれてきたとうぬぼれている連中には何よりも望ましい方法だとスウィフトは書いている。
翔吾君は皮肉の天才だな。
僕ではなく、スウィフトがね。
Due to Psychopath's somewhat realistic character designs, this naturally makes him feel somewhat out of place. This is incredibly fitting, as Makishima is known as criminally asymptomatic, which is a person that cannot be properly read by the Sybil system, no matter the situation. Makishima proves how the system does not dictate him at the end of episode 11, where he murders Yuki right in front of Akane. All the while, his crime coefficient is of the purest white. It's an incredibly brutal scene, and one that proves how menacing Makishima can be, as the Dominators cannot harm him compared to normal weapons like guns and knives. In other words, in order to get rid of him, someone has to work outside the law. Going back to the show's inspirations, they quite literally spell out some of the books that inspired the writing of Psychopaths. In one of my favorite scenes, Makishima has a conversation with Gusun Cho, one of his trusted allies, about the importance of physical books compared to the commonly used ebooks. Beforehand, he talks about how Japan, in his opinion, has become somewhat of a parody of novels such as 1984 by George Orwell, or books written by author Philip K. Dick, who has written books like The Minority Report, which is, of course, a science fiction novel based on dystopia. Psychopaths, and by extension Urobuchi, do not exactly hide the inspirations for the show, and this scene to me proves that. It adds an interesting layer to him if you read many of the works that the show was based on, but that's just me speaking. When it comes to Makishima, I personally find the most interesting part about him is how he influences others, whether they be his own followers or people of the police force. When looking through the perspective of others, they slowly spin webs that characterize Makishima in different and interesting ways. It is my opinion that they show off Makishima's layers in a way that makes him even more different than others, as if he has some other purpose. I'll try and go in depth regarding my feelings on this in a moment. Regarding Yuji, a man who was bullied so much due to the Sybil system being unavailable in the drone factory, Makishima naturally gives him the tools necessary for Yuji to access his quote-unquote true self that would naturally be shunned by Sybil and society itself. Makishima sees Yuji as another victim of Sybil's oracle, due to him being the lightning rod for abuse and bullying in the facility he works for, so why wouldn't he try and assist someone that he can identify with? Using the disc that Makishima gives him, Yuji malfunctions the drones him and his co-workers are designing, and uses them to slowly get away with the murder of those who bully him due to Sybil. This naturally allows Yuji to run free, and get away with something he's desired for so long, his true self no longer being shackled, thanks to the silver-haired man who gave the victim of abuse some freedom from the system that binds all of Japan. Of course, his plan is ruined, but nonetheless, Makishima gave a man some purpose to go on and live in the society that abandoned him. This is where Makishima, to me, slowly begins to become a man who values the enjoyment of those like him, in his own psychotic and disturbed way. The last point I would like to make is just something that I found somewhat interesting. as it is the first time we see Makishima reference literature. The name of the disc that Makishima gave Yuji is named Johnny Mnemonic, a short story written by author William Gibson, whom Gusan Cho references later, but regardless, Gibson is an author famous for dystopian and cyberpunk works. During the arc involving Spooky Boogie and the virtual world, Makishima finds Mito as someone who is so obsessed with the virtual world that it overtakes his life, to the point where he murders and steals virtual identities to replace the shell of a man that is his real self. Mito is empty inside, like Makishima. Mito disappoints Makishima, however, getting caught and eliminated by the police. Mito was hollow and had no identity, trying to naturally take the identities that he feels a jealousy towards or feels they are unworthy of their status. Makishima could identify to an extent, but was quickly disappointed due to Mito's pathetic nature. Rikako and her father tackle the topic of art in Psychopaths in a very brutal but interesting way, seeing how the minds of visionary artists can be affected by a system of Sibyl's caliber. Roichi Auriel was a famous artist, known for making paintings that could be conceived as dark or scary at times, and as with most art, people who viewed Roichi's paintings naturally started to think about what the paintings may represent, which could naturally lead to some dark or violent thoughts regarding the meaning of the work. Sibyl does not approve, which is why they condemned Roichi to the point where he stopped making art and became so empty inside because the system did not allow him to pursue the passions that he was born with. I want you to picture the one thing that you are passionate about in this world. Now imagine that the thing that gives you a purpose is deemed by society as harmful or disturbing, causing you to stop pursuing the artistic dreams you desired. You would end up like Roichi too, just a shell of a man that's been turned inside out by society. Makishima, I would imagine, relates to this, as his killings are detrimental to the structure of Japan, much like the art that Roichi made, in its own twisted way. Roichi's vegetative state left Rikako alone, no longer with a father who can speak with her. So she grew to hate Sibyl just as much as anyone would in that situation. Rikako grew to idolize her father's artwork and took up the mantle of the artist in her family, in her own psychotic way, making artwork of the bodies of her fellow classmates in disturbing positions, trying to show off her artistic talent as a metaphorical middle finger to society itself for shunning both her and her father's artwork. Makishima admired Rikako's artistic vision, not just due to his natural sadism, but as a push for human desires to no longer be bound by Sibyl. When people discovered the bodies, their natural reaction was to at first be shocked and horrified, and who wouldn't? But humans would then think as to why someone would do something like that to a body, especially in a society where violence is not a common occurrence. As with all art, it made others think. Rikako eventually fails, which helps Makishima develop interest in Kogami, which I'll of course be touching on later. Toyohisa is a sadistic man, plain and simple. A wealthy individual who speaks with Makishima in private, all while partaking in fox hunts with his two robot dogs named Lovecraft and Kafka, named after the authors with the same last names. Unlike some of his other followers, Toyohisa isn't exactly angry with the Sibyl system compared to others. He still conducts underground hunts that remind him of his days as a soldier, so why would he be vengeful against it? This is a man who views technology as a necessity, as seen during his conversation with the news reporter interviewing him after he became a cyborg. Toyohisa is a good friend of Makishima and is one of the few people that has intimate conversations with him, unlike Rikako or Mido. His first victim is Rikako, who he later makes a pipe from her bones after successfully hunting her down, which seems to indicate that he takes pride in his work like any kind of sadistic killer. His last fox hunt is one of the most important parts of the show. Toyohisa wants to help out Makishima by giving his prey, Shinya Kogami, a test. In other words, if Kogami defeats Toyohisa, then he will be of interest to Makishima and his goals even more. But if Kogami is killed, then Makishima no longer has an enforcer to worry about. Either way, the test is a win-win scenario for him. Experiencing the thrill of the hunt makes Toyohisa feel alive, way more than anything else in this world. The hunt with Kogami brings him back memories of when he was a soldier, making him feel even more alive. In fact, it's the happiest he's been in a long time. It shows that the thrills he gets when hunting people still apply, even if his body is no longer as human as it used to, resulting in him experiencing a ode to joy, if you will. As Beethoven's famous symphony plays in the background, Toyohisa has the last happy experience of his life as he nearly kills Kogami, all as Makishima watches him die with a smile on the cyborg's face. Toyohisa helped Makishima appreciate his life more, allowing him to view the finer things in life with a smile on his face. Before I get into the last three characters, I'd like to briefly touch upon the arc of the show involving the helmets, and why Makishima uses them to cause chaos. In my opinion, the scariest scene in the show is where Makishima gives a criminal a helmet, and then said criminal uses it to beat his ex-girlfriend to death in public, with nobody opposing him. How would you react if you saw someone doing that in public? Most people would intervene, but in Psychopath's society, citizens are used to there being practically zero violence. Plus, there's also the fact that if they intervene, their hue will spike upward and there will be more chaos. Eventually, Makishima supplies more criminals with helmets, wanting them to create riots and murder people as much as they want. This causes average people to start rebelling against the men and women wearing helmets, increasing the spikes in people's hues and causing a violent pandemic on the streets with many dying painfully. Makishima does this to make people lose faith in the system, as well as to serve as a distraction, while he and Gusun Cho infiltrate the building where the Sibyl system is kept, with the goal of destroying it once and for all. Although the segment involving the helmets is somewhat minor, I do like how it characterizes Makishima by showing how he will do almost anything to destroy the Sibyl system. Plus, it was just incredibly scary, and touches upon a lot of commentary about the society of the world. Makishima's murder of Akane's friend Yuki is the first time that Akane truly loses her naive faith in the system that she uses to defend others, thus sparking the character growth of Akane during the rest of the show. This traumatic event helps Akane become less of a weakling and become more of a professional and mature detective. While she still believes that Sibyl will help her out, she stays true to her ideals, but in a different way, and actually helps Sibyl later on directly. It's subtle, but just one moment allowed Akane to transform into a completely different character than the first half of the show presented us with. So in other words, Makishima transformed Akane into one of the best characters in the show, and allowing her to develop accordingly into one of the best protagonists of all time. Makishima's relationship with Kogami is arguably the most important character dynamic in the show, and I'll try and explain why I find these two extremely fascinating whenever they share the screen together. Long story short, but after Makishima murdered the old partner of Kogami back when he was a detective, Kogami swore revenge against him for not only murdering his partner, but just the fact that he's an expert criminal mastermind. After Kogami catches Rikako and manages to humiliate her, Makishima takes an interest in the Enforcer, as he used methods that were not only reckless, but Makishima admires his physical and mental strength in a dangerous situation. This is why he has Toyohisa engage in a hunt against him, as a test to see how he can handle in a situation where he's not only being hunted down by an expert killer, but where he has to protect Yuki from being hurt as well. Any other member of the police force would be uninteresting to him, but Kogami's nature to be reckless and use methods that most officers wouldn't use spikes the interest in Makishima's mind. He hates order and prefers chaos, so someone who works outside of the law at times would naturally be of great interest to him, especially in a world where Sybil keeps society in order. In Makishima's head, Kogami should be the only one to stop him, because a man who puts as much stakes against the system is worthy of defeating him. Much like Toyohisa, if Kogami gives him a proper challenge, then Makishima will start to feel alive, while society has abandoned him and made him feel alien all his life due to his clear psychopaths. For the last segment of this analysis, I'd like to talk about Makishima's final moments for a bit, and then wrap up my final thoughts on the character. After Sybil offers the opportunity for Makishima to become a part of the system itself, Makishima delivers one of the most bone-chilling quotes in the show.
それはそれで良い気分になれるのかもしれないが、あいにく審判やレフェリーは趣味じゃないんだ。そんな立場では試合を純粋に楽しめないからね。僕はね、この人生というゲームを心底愛しているんだよ。だからどこまでもプレイヤーとして参加し続けたい。
Makishima rejects the idea of becoming something that he detests with all his heart. Sybil is the system that alienated him from society because he's one of the only people that can experience the joys of life properly while others are shackled. Or is it perhaps something more? It's hard to say given how cryptic and mysterious Makishima is, but I think there is more to it than meets the eye, although I'm not entirely sure what it is. But now, I'm going to talk about Makishima's final plan, some of the symbolism involving it, and how I believe Makishima tries to liberate Japan. Makishima's final plan is to destroy Japan's food supply, which will not only cause chaos, but also cut off the supply to the brains that power Sybil, causing Japanese society to collapse, and a new one to rise from the ashes. Before Makishima engages in his plan, you see him reading the Parable of the Sower, which is a Bible verse that has a lot of symbolism regarding the role of Makishima at this point in the story. The verse is about a man who plants seeds in many different places, and while the majority of them die off, the ones that survive have a huge price. Jesus in this says that the truth will always be preserved, even if it costs much. Makishima tries to change the world by destroying Sybil, and his actions and ideological beliefs about the system change individuals like Akane, Kogami, and many of his followers into becoming different people because of it. Akane tries to force change into Sybil, and Kogami is no longer shackled by Sybil due to taking down Makishima himself, as well as the countless examples of how he has changed the lives of others to help them discover themselves and live happy lives. Before Makishima dies, he becomes a messiah, one who intends to enlighten Japan and bring happiness to all of its citizens in a twisted way, allowing people to think freely like he does. His actions created a movement, a religion, if you will, involving the destruction of Sybil and the preservation of free will in a society that abandons the concept of free will. In the end, though, Makishima fails in his goal, but at the same time, he goes out in the way he always wanted, to be taken down by someone of their own free will, and not someone following the orders of a system that alienated Makishima from the rest of the world. It's ironic that Makishima gave so many individuals a purpose for living when he never truly had one for himself until his last breath with the barrel of a gun pointing at the back of his head. Although, this would always have been the best way for a man who just did not belong in the modern world to meet his end, with the trigger being pulled by a man who acted outside of Sybil.